This is a talk by Rodney, Nick, and Hunter from Syracuse University. And we have Rodney online with us. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, now, first of all, just want to be able to thank everyone involved in being able to put on the conference. It's a wonderful experience, and thank you very much for the invitation here. Very excited to be able to and honored to be able to be a part of it. Nick is also joining me for the presentation today, so he'll be able to introduce himself here in a moment, and then also cover the main empirical sides of all of this. And as was mentioned, I'm Rodney Paul. I am designer director of the sport analytics program at Syracuse. We're moving into our area as kind of the first college of sport in the United States. So we're really excited about that with the announcement coming on July 1st. And my background a bit in this is I've always been a huge fan and interested in the sport. Involved my research with this about the time I was finishing my dissertation, now going back, about a quarter of a century here, about 25 years, and a variety of work over time with that. And I have the incredible pleasure to be able to work on this with two now former undergraduate students, in addition to tomorrow. I want to thank everybody again for the student portion of this, which is great to see, and a couple of students be able to present at that as well. But Nick, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm a PhD student at Syracuse in the Information Science and Technology program. I've been working with Dr. Paul now for probably about 8 years doing research. My main focus is on team and player performance, as well as organizational decision making, and some social media analysis.
Thank you very much. And Hunter would have joined us today, but he just graduated and took a job with the Minnesota Twins of Major League Baseball. So very excited for him. But so much of what he did really drove what this analysis, what this paper is actually on. Nick, if you can go next slide. So basically, this came about initially through a conversation between Hunter and myself. All of our students in the program do a senior thesis, and he wanted to be able to investigate fighting in hockey. And so we had some conversations as to where to go. Now, I had first done this research, like I said, about 25 years ago, back in dark ages in terms of data and being able to get it and obtain it, but wanted to be able to figure out where it stands and what's been done since. And he did a great job of being able to build the background of all of this. And what we have is that fighting is obviously controversial. It's something that brings a bunch of different health risks on both short-term and long-term injuries on the ice while it might be occurring, in addition to things that occur, brain injuries, etc. long-term. Also, the opposite issues in the sense of that what might happen injury-wise if fighting were removed. All of those things are interesting type concepts, but there's also the fan aspect here, the entertainment aspect. Much of the research had done in the past, both in the NHL and on the minor league and other junior leagues that were able to get data and look at, basically showed interest in fighting from the fans, which is not that surprising. And attending games around different places in U.S. and Canada have been able to do almost universal reaction of fans seeming to enjoy the activity. Right up there with a goal, or maybe in some places even more so than a goal. What that says, don't necessarily know, but is something that was interesting and shows up in the data for this. So in trying to be able to figure out where to go, Hunter and I discussed and came up with the idea of, what's going on in terms of the game action? Can we look at the play-by-play data and then be able to investigate something along the line of shot attempts, Corsi, possession, to be able to see what happens in the window, after a fight occurs? Because some of the studies, as I'll mention here in a second, show very limited or, no result in terms of a trailing team being able to use a fight to score the next goal or win, but is there something that's happening there that could be interesting? And then beyond that, what Nick was able to bring into this as well is the idea of a fight model throughout the game. So thought we have these disparate parts, let's bring them together and be able to see if we can get a paper out of it to be able to talk about what's going on in the modern game. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, my research on this goes back to the early 2000s, built upon Jones's research in the 1990s, showing these positive effects in terms of NHL attendance on fighting. Again, we'd be able to eliminate things there with like sellouts, et cetera. So just looking at teams that were not selling out, where there is some kind of differences there. Those studies were really based on like reduced form models, as were the other studies that were done mentioned here on the AHL, the ECHL, CHL, et cetera, in the sense that we're basically saying, well, prices are fixed. They go ahead and set them at the start of the season. It's endogenous and now can be able to use a reduced form model. Obviously, since then till now, the process in terms of selling tickets and prices have changed, right? The primary market has moved to dynamic ticket pricing. I got to be able to study that, got access to some data when that was first introduced to be able to see how teams were using it. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of game factors that go into this. Fighting was a small one that was not necessarily very big. It differed by teams, not as much as winning per se, which tended to play a very big role, or role of opponent. But those type of things have changed for the NHL, maybe not so much in essence for the minor league teams in terms of investigating this. With this in mind, Fortney studied recently this and found the opposite relationship, a negative correlation between fighting and attendance at the NHL in more recent times. So again, this could be a preference switch. So it leads to the question of, why is it in the game? What does it lead to? Is it something that's just about fans, or could it be something that actually is impacting what's happening on the ice? Next slide, please. So to be able to do this, again, looking at some of the background literature here, this is just a minor selection of that. Hunter had put together a very, very large portion of this. So anything that I cut down for this particular paper was just in the nature of me cutting it down. That's many, many more studies that are out there within the original lit review that can be done. But Goldschmidt and Laird and Doyle basically looked at what I mentioned previously. Were there any impacts on next goal or winning after go ahead and being able to have a fight, to be able to try to change the flow of the game, change the momentum of the game, and did not find those effects being there. Similarly, a bit before that, Coates' study did not find better team outcomes in terms of fighting with this as well. So again, in terms of being able to look at this for what does it lead to the end product on the ice, namely wins or chance to be able to score that next goal to get back in, nothing really jumped out from previous studies about that. Even these like Vesper and Niffen studies, very interesting about where fighting fits in. You had the idea in Vesper's study of being a strategic use, in Niffen's study about cohesion within the team. There are different elements out here, but both again get back to the idea that any kind of effects further on in the game are generally weak. So what we have here is, at this point in time, the idea that, well, fighting may affect just fan interest and perception much more than performance. So where we decided to be able to go with this was thinking about it in a couple of different ways. One goes ahead and gets to be is that, well, maybe the goals don't show up, but it still goes ahead and leads to some kind of impact on the game from the trailing team's perspective. But also maybe it's something that happens with both teams, that in terms of the energy or what happens within the arena following a fight could affect both team performance, which was not really addressed in those previous studies. And with that, we'll turn over to Nick to describe what he did.
Thank you. So Dr. Paul mentioned we looked at play-by-play data. We have 3 seasons of data, 2021-22 season over to 2 seasons ago, now that we are finishing up the 2024-25 season, finishing our sample in 2023-24. So we have over 1.3 million time-stamped events. In our paper, we detail what kind of events those are. Mainly what we're going to be focusing on are shot attempts. So obviously goals are pretty infrequent events, and therefore it might not be the case to say, well, goals don't happen more often or anything like that after a fight. So instead we use Corsi, which is just all types of shot attempts, as a proxy for offensive activity, to see if basically our first analysis is comparing the Corsi rates for both teams before and after fights, and see is there any momentum shifts in terms of offensive activity for either team in different game scenarios. And then lastly, we use a few logistic regressions to model the probability that an event is a fight based on a bunch of different game scenarios. So first, just to see the sample of the data, about 80% of all games feature zero fights, so fights are still relatively infrequent. And then we have about 20% of all games having at least one fight, where we can see that more than one fight breaking out is pretty rare there. And I think the maximum across one game in our 3 seasons of data is about 6 fights. So I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but I'm assuming there was a few players on both teams that didn't really care for each other very much. So to talk about basically our analysis of looking at pre-fight and post-fight Corsi rates, basically what we have here is a demonstration of some data that we have. So this is one game between the Flyers and Blue Jackets, about the first 7, 8 minutes of the game. We create pre-fight windows and post-fight windows. So basically every pre-fight window is all the events from the start of the game until the fight occurs. In the post-fight windows, we have 4 of them that we use for this analysis. It's the 2 minutes after the fight, 5 minutes after the fight, 10 minutes after the fight, and then the duration of the time from the fight occurring until the end of the period. So if you notice, basically about 2/3 down in terms of our data set here, we have a fight breaking out. This is about 6 minutes into the game between the Flyers and the Blue Jackets. So all the events that take place before the fight, we consider a pre-fight window, and then all the events, in the 2 minutes after. In this case, we're just going to show the example of a 2-minute post-fight window, is our post-fight window. So in terms of calculating our Corsi rate, which is just Corsi per minute, we can see here for the Flyers, their team ID is 4. So if we look over in terms of the events and the team ID, we see that basically they just have 2 shot attempts in this pre-fight window. You can see one here in terms of shot on goal. And then this block shot up here, the team ID is 29. And in this case, with the NHL, how they store their data is when you have a block shot, it's from the perspective of the team that blocked the shot, not the one taking it. So they have basically 2 shot attempts in these first 359 seconds of the game. We take 2 divided by 359 to get Corsi per second, and then to have it a little bit more digestible and interpretable, we just multiply it by 60 seconds to get Corsi per minute. So the Flyers in this pre-fight window go ahead and have a Corsi rate of 0.334, and the Blue Jackets were doing much better in terms of their offensive production with 7 total shot attempts. Same formula there, we get a Corsi rate of 1.17. And then after the fight breaks out in that 2-minute period, we have 2 shot attempts. Once again, we have a shot on goal by the Flyers, and then a blocked shot on by the Blue Jackets. So another shot attempt for the Flyers. So their post window there in terms of their Corsi rate is 1 for the Flyers and 0 for the Blue Jackets. So we run a bunch of t-tests, basically a bunch of paired t-tests to see what is the effect of the fight in terms of the pre-fight window compared to the post-fight window. This is only fights that occur after the first 2 minutes and before the last 2 minutes of the game. So we make sure that every pre-fight and post-fight window has at least 2 minutes of time that passes so that there's enough time going on that there can be some kind of offensive productivity. And then this is also only fights that resume with even strength after the fight. So one of the reviewers mentioned in our paper, basically, did you account for anything in terms of when there's an instigator penalty or something like that, where after the fight there's a power play, as that could be a confounding result. So we eliminate those type of fights, and we're left off with about 65% of all fights in our data set, which is 630. And you'll notice here, if we look at all fight scenarios, we don't see any significant results, and the same thing with tie game scenarios. But what becomes really interesting, and we think is a driving force for what's happening with fighting in the NHL, or at least part of it, is what happens when there's a lead in the game. So what you'll notice across all scenarios is that the team that's trailing going into the fight generally benefits in one or either 2 ways after the fight. So generally what happens is that the team that's trailing either sees a boost in their productivity in terms of their Corsi rate or a decrease in their opponent. So if we look at, for example, the home team losing by 1, we see here that in all periods, basically in all post-fight windows, besides the first 2 minutes after the fight, so the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes until the end of the period, we see significant results in terms of a higher mean difference for Corsi rate after the fight. And we see basically from 2 minutes to 10 minutes after the fight that the away team actually sees a decrease in their offensive productivity. We can see basically the same results to some of the extent either one of 2 of those things happening when the home team's winning by 1 or the home team is losing or winning by 2 or greater. So in terms of winning by 1, we see that there's nothing really happening to the home team. They're not seeing a boost or a decrease, but the away team, who's trailing by 1 in this case, sees an increase in their Corsi rate across all types of periods. When there's a bigger difference in terms of The score differential from the home team, they're losing by two or more. We see a significant negative effect across all periods for the away team. We see a little bit of a boost in terms of the 10-minute period for the home team, but really it's about the away team not playing as well. And then the same thing for the home team winning by two or more. We see a significant decrease in their productivity across all windows there. And it might not seem like the mean difference is all that great, but just as a point of reference, the average Corsi per minute for the home team and the away team across our entire sample is about 0.98 per minute for the home team and 0.95 for the away team. So I think the best example of kind of what's happening here in a post-fight window is looking at this case where the home team is losing by one in those first 5 minutes afterwards. We see that the mean difference for the home team again is about 0.16, and that correlates to about, just about a 16% increase in Corsi activity. And for the away team, this negative 0.19 is about a 20% decrease in Corsi activity. So when you couple those two results together, you see that there's a pretty big difference in terms of momentum after a fight compared to what was going on before it. Now here's a few graphs to see what this looks like visually. In all cases, these are just our four scenarios where we see significant results. So home team losing by one, home team winning by one, and then losing and winning by 2+. In all cases, the darker gray bar is the home team, and the lighter gray bar is the away team. You can see here that basically, obviously when the home team's losing by one, we basically see a positive and negative effect for the trailing and the leading team in both cases. But even if you look at basically when the home team's winning by one, there's not too much going on for the home team in terms of different results, especially if you look at until the end of the period, the Corsi rate for them actually increases. But we see that the away team benefits, across all periods. And I'd be happy to come back to this slide in the future too. Now, to compare this with other events, basically, if we look at all other penalties for both the home team and the away team, as well as goals, I basically did the exact same analysis with the pre and post event windows and went ahead and applied the same methodology in terms of the first two and last 2 minutes. Now, the first thing I'll focus on for a second is with home and away goals. We basically see the same effect no matter what. For both teams right after a goal across all periods, we basically see decreased Corsi activity there, so we're not too concerned about focusing on that. But if we look at what happens after a home and away penalty, the results are as expected, right? So a home penalty, we'd expect obviously the away team's going on the power play for usually the 2 minutes after, sometimes the 5 minutes after. We see a significant decrease in Corsi rate for the home team, increase for the away team, the opposite for when an away team goes ahead and gets to have a penalty. So I think what is good about looking at these results is that there's not a huge increase or decrease in terms of the mean differences when you look at what happens after a home or away penalty compared to what happens after a fight when a team is trailing versus leading. So what we kind of, when we look at these two results together, we see that a fight might be worth about 25 to 50% in terms of what the post-fight activity looks like compared to even a penalty. So pretty strong results when you compare it to what goes on with home and away penalties. So overall, our findings in terms of these are that trailing teams might go ahead and be able to show Corsi increases up to about 16%. And if you look at some of those post-fight windows for the leading team, the opponents when they're leading go ahead and might have Corsi dropped up to about 30%, with a pretty significant result there. The biggest impacts happen when the home team is losing by one. And it suggests that there might be some kind of strategic use of fighting in certain game states to be able to push momentum for your team if you are in a trailing state. And now if we look at our logistic regression results, again, trying to predict whether or not an event will be a fight, we see here really focus on model one for the most part with basically better clustered standard errors there compared to the heteroscedasticity robust standard errors in model two. We see here basically we don't see any significant results compared to a tie game and the likelihood of a fight breaking out when the score differential is only one. But regardless of which team is winning or losing here, whenever there's a score differential of two or greater, we see a much bigger increase in the probability of a fight breaking out by a factor of about 1.5 up to 1.6, depending on which team is winning. If we look at basically the time remaining in the second period and third period, all of those results suggest that as the game goes on, fights are less likely to break out if you consider all of these things equal here. And then with hit counts and penalty counts, basically, as the game gets rougher and rougher over time, we expect more fights to break out in those cases as well. We don't see anything with Corsi differential. Likely this is being picked up by score difference. Basically, the team that has, more goals in the game likely has a higher Corsi differential as well. And then if we operationalize score differential as a continuous variable rather than discrete, we can see here that basically leading to the same results here, score differential in a linear term, not significant, but score differential squared. As that score differential gets greater and greater, again, basically 2 or more, we see a likelihood of the fight increasing in that case. So our models, again, what they're really pointing to is that fights are more likely to break out when there's a 2+ goal score differential. We think that perhaps that this could be a driving force in terms of trying to switch the momentum in the game. The odds obviously increase with the hit count, the penalty count. Perhaps things are getting a little bit chippy, and the refs might not be taking care of it as well. A fight might be breaking out there in terms of trying to, take the matter into their own hands. Fights are more common if you control for everything else earlier in periods of games, and obviously our model goes ahead and gets to be able to predict when a fight might break out depending on different game scenarios.
Thank you, Nick. Just to be able to finish this off, again, kind of thinking about this overall, fighting may energize the trailing teams, boosting offense, might not necessarily show up in goals as we've seen in previous studies, but it is visible in Corsi. It does lead to the, question is Corsi the best thing to be able to use here? There can wind up being much better, potential uses, maybe expected goals or other things like that, but we wanted a starting point that would be kind of simple, general, useful to be able to describe and be able to move forward. So maybe be able to utilize this as a momentum tactic, and that, overall, we still see some elements here that fighting is relevant in shaping gameplay excitement and intensity. Next slide. So overall, we do see these short-term impacts, and again, some of these are, kind of longer-term impacts too, as you see like 5 minutes or 10-minute windows that happen. More fights are more likely to occur in physical and unbalanced games, teams trailing by 2. Even though we might not have that past results to winning, we do see some things here in terms of activities. So maybe it could lead to possibilities of winning in that case, because these things might potentially lead to more goals. Even though we see just directly here in terms of the shot attempts. And how does this go ahead and be able to get to be used? We thought mainly in terms of the origins of this, of just trying to be able to say, well, where does fighting stand in today's game? But besides a kind of general usage, also be able to think about this as the findings show that, maybe it can strategically be used by coaches and players. We also think that it could be of interest to fans. If you think about social media or other type of things that are out there that people are using as second screens while watching games, having the probability of a fight, I think, might be a pretty interesting thing in terms of intensity level or other things along those lines. One of the reviewers did mention the idea of that, gambling markets and usage here. That's, not really what this was, designed for, but it is something that in today's day and age, I guess, could be a possible application of what's happening here. But again, if the fans are the ones that are interested in this, maybe the fans might be interested in that model, and the results do show some possible implications of being able to increase the shot activity. So maybe strategic use by coaches is also possible. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Questions from the audience? Yeah, please.
Thank you for the presentation. So what's the take-home message here for teams and coaches? You had the last point, the policy decisions should be balanced ethics with gameplay dynamics, when we know that between 10 and 20% of all concussions in the NHL comes from fighting. Is it worth the risk?
Yeah, again, very, very important question for this. You can kind of think about this analysis would be done given conditional on that it's still existing in the game. So going beyond that in terms of how that could possibly be able to be justified, right? The notion here gets to be that as economists, right, we do go ahead and be able to value those type of things. analysis is possible, right? But is tough to be able to put that particular value on that. In addition to the idea of, in the absence of fighting, if there's increased stick usage or other things like that that potentially could also lead to injuries, would need to be kind of analyzed with that in different leagues or different places, etc. So we're not able to do that with the data that is here right now, but we think this could be a part of that in terms of what happens on the ice with that. But again, a very, very different and very important question in terms of that. And again, from the financial side, it's again balancing any type of fan interest compared to what's happening with the player health and safety, which again is on the surface does not seem to be a question. Should just always be of player, team and safety, it's player safety, but is the unfortunate reality of the commercialized use of professional sport.
Thank you. So in the football session, there was this idea of that you should build a team based on the identity of your fans. Now, you had this example with Philadelphia, where clearly Philadelphia benefited from a fight. And I can definitely see how that sort of fit with Philadelphia's identity. Did you try to look at all in terms of which teams benefit and which teams do not benefit from fights?
Not from the standpoint of looking at the t-test or anything like that. In our logistic models, we do have home and away team fixed effects, and haven't really looked in detail in terms of anything that comes with that. Obviously, that's still trying to predict whether or not a fight breaks out. But one of the issues with looking at our t-test results in terms of fight is that, again, fights are still relatively infrequently. Like, we still have a pretty solid sample size here, but if we start to break down in terms of looking at individual teams, it might be hard to find any level of significance there. That's also why, if you look at basically the penalties and goals, you're seeing effects here of 0.025 being highly significant because we have a sample size of over 10,000. So there's a lot of ways I think we've thought about analyzing this in terms of the pre and post-fight windows, where we like to get as granular as possible, but you start to get in potentially even a little bit of a area of cherry picking certain results by looking at that level of granularity.
Yeah, no, that I think that makes sense. I mean, perhaps another way of viewing it would be to somehow tie it with correlations with socioeconomics factors or something like that, and then maybe something pop out.
Sure. Thank you.
I think Josh raised the hand.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you very much. One thing comment is the attendance in the 2022 paper you referenced. I suspect that the teams that are crappier have lower attendance. That's fairly well known. And we find in the league a lot of teams carry a lot of fighters when they're not a very good team. So there's probably a correlation there that's bearing out. My question is, did you look at all kind of the confounding issue, which relates to when a team is up by 2 goals, generally they go into a turtling sort of element or a shell defensively, which is going to highly correlate with the time when there's going to be more fights, because usually the turtling like coaches are old school coaches, and almost all old school coaches in the NHL I know would say, if you're up or down by 2 goals, there's going to be a fight. That's basically what's going to happen. So it's kind of like there's a little bit of a rule there. And then you also have the confounding factor that teams generally play a very defensive strategy when they're up or down 2 goals. So did you try and test this sort of turtling element?
No, great point with that. I think that sort of trying to be able to pick that up through the windows in terms of what happens with that, being able to think about that strategic action that's occurring there on the ice from there. But Nick, anything specific from that?
I'd say from a modeling perspective, trying to tease out the lead versus the way that the leading team is playing on defense would be a really interesting next step that Perhaps the play-by-play data would allow us to look at, perhaps not. I'm not entirely sure. I think one thing that's interesting to think about that I didn't necessarily discuss when thinking about the pre and post fight windows, in terms of the Corsi rates, is that sometimes when you see effects where, for example, I'll try to point something out when the home team is losing by 2 or greater here, and you see that the home team, outside of this 10-minute window, and it's significant at the 10% level, so pretty marginal there. You don't really see much boost for the home team, but you see a decrease for the away team. And if you think about it, right before those fights, if the lead is still 2 or more for the away team, then in all else equal, we wouldn't really see a significant difference there. But what could be driving the away team to have a lower offensive productivity is just a better forecheck there in terms of energy from the home team. It might not always be that their offense is getting better, but they're putting in greater effort and kind of getting the momentum on their side, to have more effort on the defensive side of things as well. So it's kind of a two-way street in terms of looking at what these effects are and what might be the driving force of it.
Cool. I had just one other quick question was, did you think at all about like the Tom Wilson effect of like a fighter who doesn't need to fight to have an impact on a game?
We didn't really look too much in terms of who was in these fights. We tried to tease that out a little bit, but again, you know, the idea of like an enforcer or anything like that wasn't something that we had implemented in terms of our models or anything like that. But I think that again is probably a future step that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah,
Awesome.
just one quick thing with that. So we try to look at the individual events around the hits as well. So that is not completely getting at that, but a little bit, maybe could make that more specific. But we didn't see the jumps in the shot attempt rates after the hits like we would in terms of the fights.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's so many hit events that the computing power to run these things isn't worth the payoff anyways, because they happen so often that there's just a high level of correlation between different windows because of how much overlap there is too.
Perfect, thanks. And any other questions? Okay. No, let's thank the speakers.
Nick, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure.
Nick, if you can introduce yourself.